Turkey spent over $50 million to build its largest overseas military base. Not in the Balkans, not in Central Asia, not even in the Middle East. It built it in Mogadishu, Somalia, thousands of miles from Ankara on the eastern edge of Africa, in one of the most unstable countries on the planet. The official explanation? Training Somali soldiers to fight al-Shabaab militants. A generous act of partnership, a noble contribution to African security. That's the version that made it into press releases. But when you look at where this base actually sits, when you trace the coastline it overlooks, the waterway it guards, and the deals that followed its construction, the training camp story falls apart completely. What Turkey built in Mogadishu isn't a favor to Somalia. And it's a forward operating position in a confrontation most people don't even know is happening. A confrontation that stretches across oceans, involves billions in global trade, and leads directly to one country Turkey is increasingly determined to challenge: Israel. If you're into geopolitical strategy, hidden power plays, and the engineering of modern empires, subscribe to NextBlueprint, hit like, and drop a comment telling us, did you know this base even existed? Let's start with what Turkey actually built. The facility is called TURKSOM. It opened in September 2017, and when it did, it became the single largest overseas military installation Turkey has ever operated. We're talking about a sprawling complex covering more than 400 acres on the outskirts of Mogadishu. Multiple training grounds. A barracks that can house hundreds of personnel at any given time. Command and communications infrastructure. Weapons storage. Armored vehicle bays. This isn't a field office with a few advisors handing out pamphlets. This is a full-spectrum military installation designed for long-term occupation. Since it opened, Turkey has cycled thousands of Somali National Army soldiers through its training programs. On the surface, that sounds generous. A NATO member helping a struggling African state professionalize its armed forces. But look closer at the mechanics. Turkey doesn't just train these soldiers, it equips them, arms them, and embeds Turkish officers within Somali command structures. The soldiers graduating from TURKSOM aren't just trained by Turkey. They are functionally dependent on Turkey. Their tactics, their equipment, like their chain of communication, all of it runs through Ankara. Military analysts who have studied this arrangement point out a pattern. When a foreign power trains and equips another country's military from the ground up, it doesn't just create an ally, it creates a dependency. And dependency, in the language of geopolitics, is another word for control. Turkey didn't build a training camp in Mogadishu. It built the architecture of influence. And once that architecture was in place, the real moves began. Because what came next, a deal signed in early 2024, changed the entire calculus of the Horn of Africa. In February 2024, Turkey and Somalia quietly signed a sweeping 10-year defense and economic cooperation agreement. Western media barely covered it. A few diplomatic outlets ran short pieces. That most of the world moved on without a second glance. But buried inside that agreement was a clause that should have set off alarm bells in every foreign ministry from Washington to Jerusalem. Under the terms of the deal, Turkey was granted authority to build, deploy, and operate naval forces to patrol and protect Somalia's entire coastline. That coastline stretches over 3,300 kilometers, the longest of any mainland African nation. It runs along the Indian Ocean, curves up past the Horn of Africa, and reaches into the Gulf of Aden. That last part matters enormously, because the Gulf of Aden is the final approach to one of the most critical maritime chokepoints on Earth, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Turkey didn't just sign a defense pact. It secured legal authority to project naval power at the doorstep of global trade. And there's more. In exchange for this military umbrella, Turkey reportedly received exploration rights to Somalia's offshore resources, oil and gas reserves that some geological surveys suggest could be substantial. The full scope of these concessions hasn't been publicly disclosed, but critics within the Somali diaspora and opposition figures have used blunt language to describe what happened. They say Somalia essentially handed its maritime sovereignty to a foreign power. Its coastline, its waters, its seabed, all of it managed from Ankara. Some dismiss this as exaggeration, but consider the trajectory. Turkey already operates Mogadishu's international airport through Turkish companies. Turkish firms manage the city's main seaport, the economic lifeline of the entire capital. Turkish-built hospitals and roads crisscross the country. Now add naval patrols and resource extraction rights to that list, and the picture becomes unmistakable. This isn't a partnership between equals. This is one country absorbing another's strategic infrastructure piece by piece. But this deal didn't emerge out of nowhere. Something triggered it in an event from an unlikely corner of the region that set off a chain reaction almost nobody in the West was tracking. 1 month before Turkey and Somalia signed their naval agreement, something happened that cracked open the entire geopolitics of the Horn of Africa. In January 2024, Ethiopia, a landlocked nation of over 120 million people, the second most populous country in Africa, signed a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland. Now, Somaliland is not Somalia. That distinction is essential and almost universally misunderstood. Somaliland declared independence from Somalia in 1991 after a devastating civil war. In the 3 decades since, it has built a functioning government, held multiple peaceful elections, maintained its own military, issued its own currency, and operated as a stable democratic republic, in a neighborhood where stability is practically unheard of. But despite all of that, no country on earth had formally recognized it as an independent state. Somaliland existed in a strange diplomatic limbo, independent in practice, invisible on paper. Ethiopia's MOU changed the equation. Under the reported terms, Ethiopia would gain access to Somaliland's Berbera port and potentially establish a naval presence on the Red Sea coast, something Ethiopia has desperately wanted since it lost its coastline when Eritrea became independent in 1993. In return, Ethiopia would reportedly take steps toward recognizing Somaliland as a sovereign state. Somalia erupted. Mogadishu viewed this as a direct assault on its territorial sovereignty. In Somalia's eyes, Somaliland is not a separate nation. It's a breakaway region that must eventually return to the fold. Any foreign country cutting deals with Somaliland was, by extension, carving up Somali territory. And Turkey saw its opening. Erdogan's government immediately sided with Somalia, condemned the Ethiopia-Somaliland agreement, and positioned itself as Mogadishu's protector. The timing was not coincidental. Within weeks, the sweeping defense and naval deal was signed. Turkey used the Ethiopia crisis as leverage and offering Somalia the military backing it desperately needed, and in return locking in the most strategically valuable agreement Ankara has secured in Africa. What looked on the surface like an obscure African border dispute was, in reality, the opening shot in a much larger contest, a contest over who controls the gateway to the Red Sea. If you're starting to see how all of these pieces connect, hit like so more people can find this breakdown. Because what comes next is where the real stakes become clear. Pull up a map of the region and one feature dominates everything. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow passage only 20 miles wide at its tightest point, and sitting between the Horn of Africa and the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Every ship traveling from the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea to the Suez Canal and onward to Europe must pass through this corridor. Roughly 30% of all global container shipping flows through or near it. Crude oil, manufactured goods, raw materials, food supplies, trillions of dollars in annual trade squeeze through a gap barely wider than the English Channel. We've already seen what happens when this choke point is threatened. In 2023 and 2024, the Houthis, an Iranian-backed militia controlling large parts of Yemen, which sits on the Strait's northern shores, launched a sustained campaign of attacks against commercial vessels transiting the area. Missiles, drones, and armed speedboats targeted cargo ships, oil tankers, and container vessels. Global shipping costs skyrocketed. Insurance premiums for Red Sea transit surged. Major carriers rerouted around the entire continent of Africa, adding weeks and billions in cost to supply chains. The United States responded with direct military strikes against Houthi positions, not primarily to defend Israel, as some claimed, but because the disruption to global trade was reaching a breaking point. The security of the world economy, it turns out, depends on security in these waters. Now, look at who's positioned around the strait. On the western shore sits Djibouti, a tiny nation hosting a remarkable concentration of foreign military power. The United States operates Camp Lemonnier there, its only permanent military base in Africa. China opened its first ever overseas military base in Djibouti in 2017. France, Japan, London and Italy all maintain installations. Djibouti's entire economy essentially runs on rent from foreign militaries. And on the other side, along Somalia's coast, stretching south from the Gulf of Aden, Turkey now holds naval patrol authority. It has a massive military base in Mogadishu. It controls critical infrastructure, and it has a 10-year mandate to operate warships along the entire coastline. The implications are staggering. The Bab el-Mandeb is no longer just an Iranian Houthi problem. It's becoming a multi-front contest where Turkey, Iran, China, the United States, and now Israel are all jockeying for position. Whoever influences both shores of this strait holds leverage not just over the Middle East, but over the engine of global commerce itself. And this is exactly where Israel decided to make its move, with a decision that caught nearly every foreign policy analyst off guard. On December 26, 2024, Israel did something no country had ever done. It formally recognized Somaliland as an independent sovereign state, the first nation on earth to do so. The bilateral agreement signed between the two governments covered cooperation in agriculture, technology development, trade facilitation, and, most critically, security coordination. In Hargeisa, Somaliland's capital, the response was electric. Fireworks lit up the night sky. Crowds flooded the streets waving flags. People who had waited over 30 years for the world to acknowledge what they had built, a functioning democracy in one of the most volatile regions on the planet, finally had their moment. And the country that gave it to them wasn't the United Nations, wasn't the European Union, wasn't the United States. It was Israel. But this was not a humanitarian gesture. This was precision strategy. Look at where Somaliland sits. Its coastline faces the Gulf of Aden. Its Berbera port, or portions, already upgraded with $442 million in investment from the United Arab Emirates through DP World, sits at the southern approach to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. One naval cooperation agreement, one intelligence sharing arrangement, and suddenly Israel has a strategic partner positioned directly opposite Turkey's sphere of influence in Somalia. By recognizing Somaliland, Israel didn't just make a diplomatic statement. It planted a flag on the other side of the chessboard. Somaliland is pro-Western. It's cooperative with the UAE. It holds democratic elections, and it sits on some of the most strategically valuable real estate in Eastern Africa. Everything Turkey's Somali ally is not. The reactions told the whole story. Turkey condemned the recognition immediately. Qatar followed within hours. Somalia's government in Mogadishu denounced it as a violation of sovereignty. The people who objected the loudest were the same people whose strategic position was most threatened. That's not coincidence. That's confirmation. If you think this rivalry is going to define the next decade of global power shifts, drop a comment below and subscribe. Because this is only part of the picture. The confrontation between Israel and Turkey is playing out across an area most people can't even imagine. Here's what almost no mainstream outlet is framing clearly. Israel and Turkey are locked in a strategic confrontation that extends far beyond any single issue, far beyond Gaza, beyond Somaliland, beyond any one headline. This is a systematic multi-theater rivalry that's been escalating for years, and it's now reaching a tipping point. Start in the Eastern Mediterranean. Just days before recognizing Somaliland, Israel hosted the 10th Trilateral Summit with Greece and Cyprus in Jerusalem. Three nations, each with its own deep grievances against Turkey, formally aligned on energy cooperation, joint naval exercises, missile defense coordination, and shared intelligence frameworks. The press conference was unusually direct. The leaders of all three countries openly described the alliance as a response to Turkey's growing assertiveness in the region. Greece and Turkey have nearly gone to war multiple times over maritime boundaries and airspace violations. Cyprus remains partially occupied by Turkish forces since 1974. Israel's alignment with both countries isn't casual diplomacy, it's a deliberate encirclement strategy. Move to Syria. For years, Israel has operated inside Syrian territory, striking weapons convoys, degrading Iranian infrastructure, and supporting Druze, Kurdish, and other non-Islamist minority communities. Many of these communities are directly threatened by Turkish-backed militant groups that have consolidated control over large portions of northern Syria. Each report suggests Israel has struck infrastructure that Turkey was attempting to install. Radar systems, communications networks, logistical hubs. specifically to prevent Turkey from establishing the kind of integrated military presence that would challenge Israeli air superiority in the region. Then there's Gaza. Throughout ceasefire negotiations and post-conflict planning discussions, the United States has at various points floated the idea of Turkish involvement in Gaza's security. Turkish peacekeepers, Turkish reconstruction oversight, Turkish humanitarian coordination. Israel's response has been absolute and unwavering. No. No Turkish forces anywhere near Israel's border, and the reason should now be obvious. Turkey doesn't enter conflict zones to stabilize them and leave. Look at the evidence. But northern Syria, Turkish forces entered in 2016 and never left. Libya, Turkey deployed military assets to back the Tripoli-based government in 2020, and those forces remain embedded today. Somalia. Turkey built a base in 2017, signed a naval control agreement in 2024, and has spent $1 billion making itself structurally indispensable. Once Turkish forces arrive somewhere, extracting them becomes nearly impossible. Israel understands that if Turkish troops enter Gaza, even under a peacekeeping banner, Gaza will gradually transform into a Turkish protectorate, one with deep Islamist sympathies, one sitting directly on Israel's southern border. And threading through all of this is the IMEC corridor, the India-Middle East-Europe corridor. Talk an ambitious American-backed trade route designed to connect India to Europe through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. The route deliberately bypasses Turkey entirely. It's a direct challenge to Turkey's geographic advantage as the traditional land bridge between Asia and Europe. And it's a direct competitor to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which Turkey has also been courting. This isn't a diplomatic spat. This is a full-spectrum strategic confrontation playing out across the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, the Horn of Africa, and the trade routes that connect 3 continents. But Turkey's ambitions in Somalia are just one node in a much wider network. And that network reveals something even more alarming about what Ankara is actually building. Step back and look at the full map of Turkey's overseas military deployments. So in Qatar, a permanent Turkish military base established in 2015, expanded significantly during the Gulf diplomatic crisis. In northern Cyprus, tens of thousands of troops deployed since 1974, with no withdrawal in sight. In northern Syria, multiple operational zones controlled by Turkish forces and their proxy militias since 2016. In northern Iraq, frequent cross-border operations and semi-permanent forward bases targeting Kurdish groups. In Libya, military advisors, drone operators, and naval assets backing the government of national accord since 2020. In Azerbaijan, Turkish military support during and after the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War. And now in Somalia, a massive training base and a decade-long naval mandate. Lay these positions out on a map and a pattern emerges that's impossible to ignore. Each installation sits along a critical trade route, energy, corridor, or geopolitical fault line. Together, they form an arc stretching from the Eastern Mediterranean through the Middle East into East Africa, an arc that bears a striking resemblance to the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire at its height. Erdogan himself has never been shy about this connection. He's made numerous public references to Turkey's Ottoman heritage, to the idea that Turkey has a historical responsibility to lead the Muslim world, to the concept that modern borders drawn by colonial powers don't reflect Turkey's natural sphere of influence. Whether this constitutes a genuine neo-Ottoman ideology or merely rhetorical nationalism is debated among scholars. But the military deployments are not rhetorical. They're concrete, they're expanding, and they're accelerating. Turkey's defense industry has amplified this reach dramatically. The Bayraktar TB2 drone, once a niche weapon system, has been exported to over 30 countries. Nations that buy Turkish drones don't just purchase equipment. They enter into maintenance agreements, training partnerships, and intelligence sharing arrangements with Ankara. Each export creates another thread of dependency, another node in an expanding web of Turkish influence. In Somalia specifically, Turkey has invested over $1 billion in civilian infrastructure alone. Hospitals, roads, schools, water systems. These investments generate genuine goodwill, and they're strategically brilliant because they make Turkey structurally embedded in Somalia's daily functioning. The airport runs through Turkish companies. The seaport is managed by Turkish firms. The military is trained at a Turkish base. The coastline will be patrolled by Turkish warships. Some analysts have started using the phrase soft colonialism to describe this approach. Not colonialism in the 19th century sense, no flags planted, no governors installed, but a form of control so deeply woven into a nation's infrastructure that independence becomes theoretical. The host nation retains its flag, its anthem, its seat at the United Nations. But the roads, the ports, the military, the economy, all of it flows through Ankara. Turkey isn't building a base in Somalia. Turkey is building Somalia around itself. This is the kind of strategic maneuvering that mainstream media rarely covers in depth. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe to NextBlueprint and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Now, here's the question that should keep defense planners up at night. Imagine a scenario 5 years from now. Turkey's naval forces are fully operational along Somalia's coast. The 10-year defense agreement is halfway through and renewal negotiations are already underway. Turkish warships patrol the approaches to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Turkish intelligence assets monitor every vessel entering or exiting the Red Sea from the south. The Somali military is effectively a Turkish-trained, Turkish-equipped, Turkish-aligned force. Now combine that with Turkey's other positions. In Libya, Turkey controls access to key Mediterranean shipping lanes along North Africa's coast. In northern Syria, my Turkish forces sit astride the energy routes connecting Iraq's oil fields to Mediterranean export terminals. In Qatar, Turkey has a military presence in the heart of the Gulf's energy infrastructure. 3 of the world's most critical trade corridors, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf approaches, would all have a Turkish military footprint. Not control in an absolute sense, but influence, leverage, the ability to complicate, to delay, to impose costs. And in geopolitics, leverage is often more valuable than outright control. For Israel, this scenario represents a profound strategic threat. The Red Sea corridor is Israel's lifeline to Asian markets. The port of Eilat connects Israel to Indian Ocean trade without relying on passage through the Suez Canal, but only if the southern Red Sea remains secure. A hostile or adversarial naval presence at the Bab el-Mandeb, operated by a country that hosts Hamas leadership in Istanbul and has severed trade relations with Jerusalem, would fundamentally alter Israel's strategic calculus. For Europe, a more powerful Turkey at the Horn of Africa means another pressure point in Erdogan's arsenal, added to the migration leverage he already wields. In 2016, Turkey effectively held the European Union hostage during the refugee crisis, extracting billions in payments in exchange for stemming the flow of migrants. A Turkey that also controls Red Sea access adds another dimension of economic coercion. For the United States, it complicates everything. Washington's entire IMEC corridor strategy depends on stable, friendly control of the Red Sea passage. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti was built for a world where the main threats were piracy and terrorism. It wasn't designed for a scenario where a NATO ally, a country the US can't easily confront, is the one projecting power across the strait. Some defense analysts have begun warning quietly, in think tank papers and closed-door briefings and the academic journals that most people never read, that the Horn of Africa could become the next great power flashpoint. Not a war in the traditional sense, but a slow-motion contest over who controls the physical infrastructure of global trade. Ports, bases, patrol routes, undersea cables, resource concessions, the unsexy, invisible machinery that the entire world economy depends on. Reports suggest Israel is already moving to counter this scenario. An intelligence cooperation with Somaliland is reportedly expanding. Conversations with the UAE about coordinating Red Sea security have intensified. The trilateral framework with Greece and Cyprus adds another layer of containment in the Mediterranean. And the IMEC corridor, if it ever reaches full implementation, would create an alternative trade artery that reduces dependency on any single choke point. The race is no longer theoretical. Positions are being taken, agreements are being signed, bases are being built and expanded, and most of the world is paying absolutely no attention. The Turkish military base in Mogadishu was never really about training Somali soldiers. It was about positioning Turkey at the doorstep of global commerce and directly challenging the network of alliances that Israel, the Gulf states, and their Western partners have been quietly constructing for years. The Horn of Africa, a region most people couldn't locate on a map, is becoming one of the most contested stretches of geography on the planet. Not because of ideology, not because of religion, because of where it sits. Because whoever influences both shores of the Bab el-Mandeb holds a hand on the valve of the world economy. Israel's counter-strategy is now visible. Somaliland recognition, the Greece-Cyprus alliance, refusal of Turkish forces in Gaza, support for non-Islamist minorities in Syria, energy and defense partnerships with European powers, the IMEC corridor. Taken individually, each move looks like an isolated diplomatic event. Taken together, they form a coherent containment architecture, a systematic effort to limit Turkish expansion at every critical juncture. The next 5 years will determine whether that architecture holds, whether Somaliland's recognition leads to broader international acknowledgement and a genuine Western foothold at the Horn, whether the IMEC corridor moves from ambitious concept to functioning reality, whether Turkey's naval mandate in Somali waters translates into permanent strategic dominance, or whether it overextends Ankara's already strained resources. One thing is certain. The decisions being made right now, in Mogadishu and Hargeisa, in Jerusalem and Ankara, in the quiet waters of the Gulf of Aden, will reshape the global order in ways that most headlines won't capture until it's far too late to respond. To make the question that remains unanswered, the one that should concern everyone watching, is whether the West will back the counter-strategy Israel is building, or whether Turkey's quiet, methodical expansion will go unchecked until the map has already been redrawn. If you want more breakdowns of the power plays reshaping our world, subscribe to NextBlueprint, like this video, and tell us in the comments, do you think Turkey's strategy will succeed, or is Israel already 2 steps ahead?